Hi everyone, so in one of my most recent videos, I went over, or I was reacting to some 1-star reviews of books that I like, books that I have given 5 or 4 stars to, and it actually, I think at some point, I realized that it was starting to solidify some things that I've been noticing about reviews for a while, specifically reviews from Goodreads or reviews on BookTube. Mostly from Goodreads, I would say, because I was reacting to Goodreads reviews. Both negative and positive, really, because obviously I was reacting to negative reviews in that one. But there are things that I think, most of these things I would say are applied to both negative and positive reviews, but in a different way. And things that I've also noticed in the comments, the comment section of those reviews on BookTube videos or on Goodreads reviews. And there are things that I don't like and that I think make for kind of bad reviews or just kind of unconvincing reviews. I had made a video kind of like this about before, years ago, and this is sort of like a part 2 video of this, but I guess there are things that are maybe less obvious in comparison to my first video. Now I want to say that obviously you're allowed to review books however you want. And of course, a lot of the point of reviews is that they're subjective, in that they're going to be very different from each other and that people's takes are different. What I'm talking about, or what I'm criticizing, isn't really reviews being positive or negative by themselves, but rather that the arguments are just unconvincing. And I always find that certain types of arguments I personally find just much more convincing than other types. Obviously, like I said, you're allowed to review things however you want, but in a review, you're basically arguing for, or you're arguing against a book, or at least for your, why you're reviewing a book, negatively or positively, or in a mixed way, 3 stars. But whatever the case may be, you're still arguing for something. So I would say that this is kind of about pet peeves of mine when it comes to reviews. So the first thing that I want to mention is using adjectives by themselves to review books. I think that maybe sometimes people copy the, what is that called, the quotes that come in the covers of books. Oftentimes they will say things like enticing, exciting, riveting, I don't know, a bunch of adjectives in the cover of books. It's like, right below it says New York Times bestseller or something like that. Especially ones that don't really say anything, like ethereal, impactful, whimsical, evocative, and that's basically the review, like that, just those words by themselves. And I feel like that just tells us nothing about what is going on in the book. Like, what is impactful about a book? The ending or the way the topic is handled, or do you mean that it's really explicit in some ways? What do you even mean? And if it's ethereal, are you talking about the writing style, or are you talking about the story being fantasy or something, or the characters being kind of weird? I don't know. What are people even talking about? These are types of reviews that just don't really clarify anything, and I feel when you read a review, either you already read the book and you want to, see what other people say about it, or you want to know whether it is even worth it to read that book or not. And I think if you don't know about that book, it doesn't really tell you anything about what is going on in it, or what kind of style it has, or what kind of, what it focuses on, whether it's a character-driven novel or, plot-driven or something like that. And I think a lot of these adjectives end up being kind of negative in a way, because, for example, when I hear that something is very atmospheric or whimsical or ethereal, I generally consider, or I interpret it, because of the way that people tend to use it, I interpret it as it meaning that the writing style is really flowery. But that's not really what people say, because, I think if the writing style is flowery, you should say that the writing style is, wordy or flowery, or that it is that type of style and you would describe it. Like, sometimes whimsical can mean it's kind of like a nice way, could very well be a nice way of saying that something kind of felt unrealistic or forced, or, like the plot doesn't really make sense, or the characters aren't fleshed out, or impactful and important are sometimes used to refer to books that are just about topics that are, serious things about real life, or that the books are about a controversial subject. And obviously that's not a bad thing, but that's not that can't be the only good thing that you can have, you can say about a book as a good thing if you're reviewing it positively. But my point is that the just adjectives don't really sell anything to me And I know that for a lot of people, given some comments that I have seen regarding reviews themselves, because I feel like this booktube is kind of lacking in videos about reviewing books, at least not in depth, I guess. Like there are people explaining why or how they review things in a certain way, and that's kind of what I've seen. But I feel like it would be cooler to have more videos about reviews, essentially reviews about reviews, which is probably why I like to see those videos that are about like reading 5-star reviews of books that I gave, of my favorite books, or 5-star reviews of my least favorite books and things like that, because that kind of makes you think more about how people review things. But anyways, this also of course applies to negative reviews, like saying that this book is boring, is pretentious, and is lazy. Like, what do you mean it's boring, pretentious, and lazy? And I feel I myself have honestly gotten into that. I've made that exact same thing before, of calling something pretentious or lazy or boring, without really explaining why I think that is. And it's not really necessarily obvious what you're even referring to when you say those things, because obviously we all have different interpretations of what is pretentious or what is lazy or what is boring, especially what is boring. I mean, a lot of people consider that, introspective stuff or, diary entry kind of things are boring because it's not very plot driven, and some people say that that's precisely what they like to read. One thing that I haven't noticed this one very commonly, very often, but it's something that I've seen more than a couple of times in reviews of books. And I'm specifically talking about one adjective, specifically talking about using the word important to refer to a book when you're reviewing it. I've seen this defense of books a couple of times before, but it never really bothered me that much until I saw this review of a book by Colleen Hoover. And it was interesting because it was actually a 1-star review of that book, talking about how the book actually sucked and the characters weren't fleshed out, and just how the book was terrible, basically. And then at the end, she says something like, but you should read it anyway because it's about abuse and it's an important subject. You're kidding, right? I mean, why are you insulting my intelligence? That is ridiculous. For one, a book is never the only one to be about a subject or to be discussing a subject. There's always more books that are talking about a certain topic. Also, just because a book makes use of a certain topic doesn't mean that it's going to do it justice and that it's going to handle it well. And to be honest with you, I think some authors often just write about certain topics because they know that readers can sometimes cut them some slack because of it. But it can also backfire, I think, because some readers might cut them slack for it and be like, well, it's about something important at least, or at least it was trying to do something. But there are some readers who are going to think, actually, you know what, you shouldn't have even done this or made this book about something serious as suicide or abuse or something like that, if you weren't going to do it justice and take it seriously, and that actually makes it more of a negative view of theirs on the book. And honestly, I think some authors actually latch on those important or controversial subjects because it's probably gonna get them more sales, and also because they want or expect people to defend their books because they're about something important. Something that I didn't mention is that I actually remember that back in the day when A Little Life came out, and some people were reviewing it negatively, and I haven't read that book, but it doesn't really matter to this discussion because I remember that a lot of people were replying to negative reviews saying that they obviously had never been abused or had never known anyone who had been abused or didn't care about victims of abuse or, sexual, rape or things like that. Oh my god, that is such a terrible reply to anyone. And again, I think that does illustrate the fact that some people will defend books just based on the fact that they're about a controversial or very heavy subject that that some people just naturally want to defend. And of course I understand that, but it doesn't really make a book better, and it doesn't invalidate the criticisms of a novel just because it's about something important. Number 3 is a general idea that I see sometimes in reviews about literary fiction or classics or books that are, heavy or long or difficult. And you often see people saying that they are too dumb to understand the book. People say that when they are reviewing stuff. They straight up say, oh, I guess I was too dumb to understand what was going on in the book, right? Or I guess I was too dumb to understand the deeper meaning. And I'm sure that some people honestly do think that a book went over their head. I mean, I've definitely seen that sentiment being sincere, but sometimes it just comes across very passive-aggressive. I've certainly seen some reviews that are like, I remember that review from Beloved that I had on my video as well, which is also, I've also seen in some other literary fiction reviews that are like, oh, well, I guess the literary students, you know, the literary academia and the literature majors or whatever, I guess those people can understand it, but I guess I'm too dumb to understand it. I mean, first of all, do you want me to agree with you that you're dumb? And aside from that, if you honestly think that a book went over your head and you didn't understand it, why are you even reviewing it? I mean, you're basically telling us that you're not even qualified to review the book. Unless your point is that it was pretentious because it was something that you weren't even meant to understand or something like that. I don't know. I guess, I mean, to be fair, I do think there are books that are kind of like that. Like they're confusing on purpose in order to maybe seem deep or what have you. But I think that sometimes people just don't pay. Sometimes I think people maybe aren't experienced enough with that type of writing style or that type of structure in a novel or something like that, or maybe people just don't pay enough attention sometimes to what they're reading, or don't care to read something twice, or you know, things like that. And of course, it's not like I'm the gatekeeper for reviews and ratings. I mean, you can do whatever you want, and I understand there's a lot of people who review and rate things solely on how much they enjoyed it, and obviously there is a place for that, and that's understandable. In fact, I basically do the same thing whenever I talk about movies or music, because I don't really know that much about the theory behind movies or music, so I just kind of base my, you know, comments on them on how much I enjoyed it. But at the same time, I do feel like this argument is sometimes flipped to be used against the people who review something negatively, and it's a book that is really respected or really liked, and it's you know, literary fiction, a modern classic, or you know, especially a really old classic. There's always that person, you know, there's always that person who's like, well, you should go back to reading Twilight then. And even then, people who don't say that specifically, they often say things like, they just say things oftentimes to imply that the person who doesn't like it is just dumb. Or I guess the implication is the fact that, you know, you're assuming that this person who doesn't like this literary fiction or this classic is just not into classics or literary fiction, and they just don't have the knowledge or the experience to judge literary fiction in the first place. And I think this assumption is also mostly placed on younger women specifically, because that's the people who are associated with things like Twilight or YA or what have you. Sometimes I think people's well-structured reviews, negative reviews, are shut down just because the person disagrees with them and they're like, oh, well, it just flew over your head, you know, you just missed the point, you didn't get it. And I get that it's frustrating that someone seems to only not like something because they missed an important part of it, or you know, that it seems to be that way, at least to you or to us. But if there is a way to word it that isn't passive-aggressive, maybe that one is better. My fourth and basically last point is when someone just gives too much importance to one aspect of the book. Sometimes I read reviews that I feel are only going over one aspect of the book, and they're like, yeah, I like the characters a lot, they were very nice, and you know, they were you know, especially, you know, say something like a romance novel, it's like, yeah, this guy was very cute, you know. In literary fiction, you could just say, yeah, it was certainly, you know, having a message, or the characters were very fleshed out, or you know, just one of those things. And what about everything else? Of course, you could just assume that they liked everything else too, and that everything else was either really good or just as good as what they mentioned. I think it bothers me more for negative reviews when it's a 1-star review, but they only mention one thing that they didn't like about it, and it's like, because in a 5-star review that only mentions one thing, you can simply assume that the person just enjoyed the book overall, you know, like, yeah, that's why it's a 5-star. But in a 1-star review that only mentions one thing, you're like, what is really your problem though? I mean, I don't know, maybe it's not even personal, but it kind of makes you wonder what else about it they didn't like. Flat characters, or maybe there something happened that I didn't like. The ending was bad or something. Just one of those things. They only mention one of those things, like the ending was bad. 1 star or something. It's fine to give something 1 star and only mention one thing. I think at least if that one thing is really, really bad enough, like for example, if the ending completely, like retcons or completely contradicts everything that was going on in the book and it makes everything completely meaningless, like if a novel ended with, it was all a dream, then of course the ending would basically ruin the entire book, right? But sometimes I wonder if there's reviewers who only give things either 1 or 5 stars. Maybe because I get the feeling, maybe it's possible that those reviews that are either 1 star or 5 stars are the ones that get the most views or the most likes on Goodreads. And maybe the most views on YouTube as well. I myself even, sometimes I feel like I should round up a rating. When I give it 3.5, for example, 3.5 stars, I think maybe I should round it up to 4. And if I give it like 2.5 stars, I'm like, maybe I should round it down to 2 stars. Basically to make it a more extreme rating, because I guess that a 3-star review, just a 3-star review is probably like such an unsatisfying thing to read, and maybe one to make as well, to write a 3-star review. It's like, Another thing that sometimes I think happens, especially in negative reviews, is that some people already have an idea in their heads of what a novel is, or what a short story collection is or should be. Or just in general what a book should be. I noticed a lot of people reviewing Henry Miller's The Tropic of Cancer specifically. When they reviewed that novel, a lot of people were like, oh, this doesn't even have a plot, it's just a guy rambling, and or other people just said, oh, he's kind of an asshole or whatever, like he's an unlikable character. And I mean, for one, I think a lot of us have already established that unlikable character isn't the same thing as a badly written character. But aside from that, I think that a lot of people already have in their minds an idea that a story should be primarily, or a novel should be primarily plots. But some things are just more focused on introspection or more character driven, if you will. Those diary entry books, they tend to be more introspective like that. And I think it's kind of unfair to give 1 or 2 stars to a book just because it focuses on the thoughts and emotions of the characters. Although, like I said, I do think it makes sense to just, rate things based on how much you enjoy them. But at the same time, I feel like you should sometimes know that you are reading a book for what it is. When you read a book, it's like, well, I'm reading this knowing that it's not going to be a plot-focused novel, that it's going to be something different. And I think that also happens. I've been thinking a lot about this video that I saw recently here on YouTube about dialogue being realistic, or being, the way that people really talk. And, I think I've also several times criticized dialogue for being unrealistic or being ridiculous. And, I do think that for the most part, I do feel, in my opinion, that that is a valid criticism, depending, again, but the thing is that depends on what kind of story it is, what the story is trying to do in the first place. The same thing goes for general realism in terms of things. I do value realism, if you will, when it comes to dialogue for the most part, but I do think there are some things that they have no real reason to even be realistic in a novel in the first place. So my point isn't really that saying that something is unrealistic is an invalid criticism necessarily, but I think that we have to look at books as a whole and what they are trying to do in order to consider whether those things in that book even really have a good reason to be realistic, or it's better off if they are kind of outlandish or ridiculous on purpose. So again, this isn't really about what you're allowed to do as a reviewer, but again, I think there's reviews that are better than others, or at least more convincing than others, positive or negative or mixed or anything. And I really noticed on Goodreads reviews, at least, the most popular reviews are not necessarily the best ones and the most descriptive ones, or the ones that explain, and argue their positions, but sometimes just they tend to be the ones I would say from the most popular reviewers. And I think you'll notice that because oftentimes if you read more or less the same types of books, I think even if you read different genres, you'll probably notice that the top like 5 reviews are very familiar faces, very familiar names, people that often have the top reviews in the first place. And again, they're not necessarily good. I've definitely seen a lot of reviews in the top that are like the first or maybe the second most liked among all of them. And some of them are just like, I found this book because of this and that and the other, and I fell in love with it. And they give you a story about how they found that book and the story, what their life was like when they read the book. And it's like, so basically this isn't a review. Like I said, it will be interesting to have more videos that discuss reviews and how we should review books or how we shouldn't review books. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!